It was a dark night, one of those you only see when you're on the road alone, miles and miles of nothing. The rain was falling heavily, hitting the truck's windows like an endless hammer. I was driving down I-40, in the middle of a desolate stretch between Oklahoma and Texas, where the rain never seemed to end. The radio picked up nothing but static, and the light from the headlights cut through the dense darkness, but it seemed useless in the face of so much water. The road was empty, there was no other car around, and the feeling of loneliness was so intense that even the rain seemed louder than it actually was. I had been driving for hours, and fatigue was starting to take its toll. It was then that I saw something in the corner of the rearview mirror. A shadow moving on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just another reflection of the water, or maybe a fallen log, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a person, or what appeared to be a person, standing on the side of the road. He was wearing a black raincoat, with the hood up, but I couldn't see his face. The shape was indistinct, as if the rain was obscuring everything around it, but something told me that the figure shouldn't be there. I stopped. I don't know exactly why, but a part of me knew I had to stop. The truck screeched to a halt, and the sound of drops hitting the body seemed like a distant noise now. The figure slowly approached the window on my side, taking its time, as if it didn't care about the storm. I could not see his eyes, or even distinguish a countenance. The hood was pulled so low that his head almost disappeared into the darkness. I don't know what made me open the window, maybe loneliness, maybe an impulse, but I did it. Before I could ask if she needed help or something, the figure took a step back and, in the blink of an eye, disappeared. It wasn't there anymore. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone being there. Just the rain and the emptiness of the road. My eyes roamed both sides of the track, but nothing. Just the night and the storm. I thought it was strange, but I soon continued my journey, thinking that my mind was starting to play tricks because of tiredness and loneliness. I accelerated and continued on my way. The road seemed even lonelier after that encounter. The rain continued to pour down, as if it was trying to erase any trace of what had just happened. Those deserted streets and the sound of drops hitting the glass were the only companions on that trip. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me alone. It was as if the air around me had changed somehow, denser, heavier, but I couldn't explain why. Minutes later, the tension was replaced by an indescribable discomfort. I noticed a mark on the bottom of the passenger seat, a large, dark stain, as if someone had just sat there. But that was impossible. I didn't see anyone enter, and the bank was empty when I looked before speeding up. Those drops that ran on the bodywork were now on the seat, as if something, or someone, had just occupied that space. The smell of rain mixed with the leather of the seat suddenly grew stronger, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The strangest thing, however, was the feeling that someone was there. It wasn't just the wet mark, but the weight in the air, as if someone's presence was still in the truck. I looked in the rearview mirror, looking for the road behind me, but I saw nothing. Nothing but darkness and storm. I reached out and touched the passenger seat, almost expecting to feel something else. But instead of a cold touch, as one would expect with rain, the feeling was strange, as if there was still a residual heat, as if someone had just gotten up from there. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, beating in my chest like a drum. I thought about stopping and checking, but the road had no more gas stations, and the phone wouldn't work. I didn't want to take any chances there, alone, in the middle of a storm. And beyond that, who or what would I be looking for? He was not an ordinary person. Something told me that if I stopped, the answers wouldn't be good. What bothered me most was that, for some reason, I had the feeling that whatever it was still watching me. Not just in the truck, but there, on the road, in that endless darkness. I tried to ignore the discomfort and focused on moving forward. But the sound of rain and the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me alone. Every mile, I looked at the passenger seat again, hoping the stain was gone, but it wasn't. It was there, now more visible due to the light from the headlights reflecting off the water. The road seemed endless, and I just wanted to get somewhere, anywhere, where I could feel safe. But there was nothing there but darkness and rain. It was as if the world had disappeared, and I was trapped in a space where time didn't pass. As the storm worsened, I began to notice something stranger, the smell. Something wasn't right. It wasn't the smell of rain, nor the smell of the truck, it was something metallic, muffled. I tried not to give it any importance, but the feeling of unease only increased. My mind began to create images, as if I had seen that scene before, as if something in my subconscious knew that this was not normal. The bench was wet, but the strangest thing was that the water seemed to have been left there with almost deliberate precision. It wasn't just the rain that had wet the bench. It was as if someone had sat there, left that space for me. At one point, the truck's radio clicked. I had turned off the station because nothing would pick up, but now the static had turned into low, distant, barely audible music. I only noticed because, as I looked at the road, the sound seemed to be coming from inside the truck, as if the music was playing there, right next to me. I turned the radio key, trying to turn it off, but the sound persisted. With each beat of a new wave of rain, the music increased in volume, becoming clearer. The worst thing of all was realizing that the melody was not an ordinary song, it was, as if it were a lullaby, something soft, but loaded with a tone so strange, so disturbing, that it was impossible to ignore. It was then that my view of the road became distorted. The headlights began to flicker, as if something was interfering with their light. I tried turning on the high beams, but it felt like everything was spinning around me. The road ahead curved, but I couldn't see where. A tangle of shadows seemed to stretch, as if the rain, the darkness and my own doubts were mixing together. Panic began to take over me, and I looked back at the bench. The stain was there. But now, there was something more, a subtle shape, as if the outline of a person was being outlined on the water. I felt such a strong shiver that I almost lost control of the truck. The feeling that something was there, on the bench, watching me, was so palpable that I could barely breathe. With each second, panic took over me more, and the sound of that distant music seemed to get louder, closer. I tried to speed up, but the road didn't feel like a road anymore. It was as if I were traveling to a place where there was nothing but rain, darkness, and that unbearable sound. I don't know how long I spent there, but the minutes seemed like hours, and the feeling that someone had their hand on the back of my head, watching my every movement, wouldn't leave me. When I finally saw a gas station in the distance, something in the back of my mind was telling me to stop, but at the same time, I was scared to stop. I needed a break, but I knew if I stopped, it would be the end. I continued, ignoring the post, as if something inside me knew that stopping would be an irreparable mistake. The road, however, seemed to have no end. When I finally reached a town, the storm was starting to show signs of passing. But what I saw in the last light of the day, before turning off the truck, made me swallow hard. The mark on the seat was there, still visible, but now it seemed to have a more defined shape, as if the person had been there longer than I imagined. I stopped the truck, locked the doors and got into the cab, shaking. I didn't want to know anything anymore. The music suddenly stopped, the rain subsided, and the night became completely silent. But before I closed my eyes, one last sensation hit me, something more frightening than anything I had ever felt. I was no longer alone. I didn't know if there was something with me or if it was my mind playing games with me, but I swear I felt the weight of a presence on the next bench. When morning came, the road was quiet again, but I knew I could never look at that bench the same way again. Since then, I have never seen that figure on the road again. The rain, the music, the feeling of being watched, everything disappeared. But to this day, whenever I pass that stretch of I-40, I feel a chill in my stomach and a slight pressure in the passenger seat, as if someone is there, waiting. The only thing I can say is that, after that night, nothing was ever the same again. I was crossing one of the many old bridges that exist in isolated parts of the U.S. roads, more precisely in the interior of Louisiana. The rain had let up, but the sky was heavily clouded, creating a dim, melancholy light. The bridge looked old, with worn wood and some loose boards. The kind of bridge that looks like it could collapse at any moment. But, as always, it was another one of those crossings that are part of being a truck driver. I didn't think twice when I entered it, despite its appearance. The radio, as always, only picked up static, so I didn't worry too much. I just wanted to cross quickly and continue on my way. But as I got further along, something started to feel off. The bridge didn't end. The path in front of me stretched endlessly, and I began to wonder if I was losing track of time, if I had started to see things. The radio, which had previously had ordinary static, suddenly began to fail. Every time I tried to adjust the tuning, it seemed like something was interfering. It wasn't just the rain, it was as if the bridge itself was sucking out the sound, erasing any signal. I was forced to turn it off. It made no sense, but the road in front of me was becoming more and more like a mirror, an endless repetition of the same scene. It was like I wasn't going anywhere. The worst of all was when I looked back. Normally, you can see the road you've already traveled, even if the conditions aren't the best. But there was nothing behind me. The road had simply disappeared. I braked, and the truck stopped abruptly, but I couldn't see the end of the bridge, nor the beginning of the road behind me. There was just an endless expanse of old wood, with the same ravines and the same structure, without any variation. My heart started to beat faster, and a feeling of dread came over me. How was this possible? Where was the road I was coming from? I tried to reverse, but the truck wouldn't move. The engine was still running, but I was trapped there, as if the bridge had become a prison. Fear began to take hold of me in a real way. What was that feeling like I was being pulled? It wasn't just the impression of being lost, it was as if the bridge itself was trying to keep me there, to swallow me, to make me walk this endless path. I looked ahead and nothing changed. The scenery was always the same, with no sign of advancement, as if I were in a loop. The silence was absolute, without the sound of the wind, without the sound of the water below the bridge, nothing. Just the sound of the truck's engine and the sound of my breathing, which now seemed heavier. It was as if the air was thicker. I didn't know what to do. It made no sense that the road was gone, and the idea of continuing forward seemed even more insane than the idea of going back. I looked at the truck's dashboard, trying to find something that could help me, but the distance marker seemed to be stuck. The odometer wasn't reading anything, like I wasn't moving forward at all. And it was at that moment that the sound of the radio returned, but this time, it wasn't static. It was a voice. Low, almost whispering, but clear enough for me to hear. The voice didn't make any sense. She didn't say words that I recognized, but still, she seemed to call to me. I turned the radio dial angrily, trying to turn it off, but the voice only got louder. It was as if the bridge was trying to communicate with me, trying to swallow me with words that didn't make sense. My body started to shake. The voice grew louder, stranger, more desperate. I didn't know if this was real or if my mind was starting to give way, but the feeling that something was wrong, very wrong, intensified with every second. I looked out the window, but all I saw was an endless stretch of the same bridge, dark and empty. Desperately, I tried to open the door to get out, to see if I could understand what was happening. but the door wouldn't open. I went to the window and, when I tried to lower the glass, I realized that the wind wasn't coming from outside. The air was still, and the water on the side of the bridge seemed not to move. The fear, now, no longer came from being lost. It came from the feeling that everything around me was frozen, as if I were the only living being in the world, trapped in an endless nightmare. The sky was heavy, the clouds were closing in like a lid, and the water below seemed too dark, as if it weren't real water. I looked back at the dashboard and noticed that the hands on the clock were stopped. Not only did the odometer not move, but time had somehow stopped as well. That bridge wasn't real. Nothing about it was real. I was trapped in a place that shouldn't exist, and the feeling that something was watching me from somewhere on the bridge, consumed me every second. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing I knew: I couldn't stay there. I couldn't leave. I couldn't go back. I was trapped. I don't know how long I spent there. Hours? Minutes? The clock still didn't move, and the radio continued with that whispering voice, a constant agony in the back of my mind. I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was happening inside my head. My every movement felt futile, as if the bridge itself was forcing me to stay, disorienting me. The feeling of being watched grew every second, and fear took over me in an indescribable way. I looked around and what I saw was always the same: old wood, the sound of water that didn't flow, and the rain that never fell. It was then that, suddenly, the radio stopped. The silence returned with terrifying force. There was no longer any sound, not the engine, not my breathing, not that whisper. The truck was stopped, completely motionless, and I didn't know what else to do. I looked ahead, and something changed. The bridge seemed to be stretching even further than before, as if the distance had no end. There was no exit sign, there was no other way. The road in front of me disappeared into the fog, and panic took over me. I no longer knew what was real. I no longer knew if I was in a nightmare or if reality had been distorted in some way. I then tried to do what anyone would do: I sped up. But nothing happened. The truck didn't move. I turned the ignition key and pressed the accelerator, but it was as if the bridge was holding the truck back, as if it was feeding on me, on my fear, on my frustration. I looked back one last time, and realized that, somehow, there was no longer a road. There was no longer a bridge behind me, just a wall of fog, a complete absence of everything I knew. The feeling that he was trapped somewhere outside of time and space was overwhelming. And then, out of nowhere, everything stopped. The sound returned, the light returned to normal, and I was back on the normal road. The bridge was gone. The road in front of me was clear, with the sun starting to set over the horizon. I was at a different point on the road, as if I had been transported. There was no more bridge, no fog, no feeling of being trapped. The road was before me, as it should be. What happened there? I still don't know. But one thing is certain: after that day, every time I see an old bridge, a part of me wonders if I really left there, if I'm still stuck somewhere, waiting to cross a bridge that never ends. It was a cold night, and I had been on the road for hours. I-80 was deserted, save for a few distant headlights and the immensity of darkness, broken only by the constant sound of the truck's engine. I was approaching a small town in the middle of nowhere, where the only sign of life was the railroad tracks that crossed the road. The light from my headlamp reflected off the rusty tracks, creating a dark and almost surreal atmosphere. I was already tired, the trip was long, and that stretch of road seemed like an eternity. Crossing the railway seemed to be just another one of those necessary stops to move on. But something was strange that night. As I approached the railway crossing, I noticed something unusual. I saw lights in the distance, as if a train was coming towards me, illuminating the darkness with its headlights. At first, I thought it was a reflection or an illusion caused by the light from my own headlights. But the lights were approaching quickly, and I soon realized that a train was indeed coming. The only thing that surprised me was the speed at which he seemed to approach. I stopped the truck before the railway, as I always do, waiting for the train to pass, but it never arrived. I stood there for a long time, the train's headlights illuminating the road in front of me, but nothing happened. I looked at the tracks and saw that the lights were getting closer and closer, but the train itself was not in sight. I stood there, not knowing what to do. The sound I expected to hear, the sound of the train passing by, was also absent. What should have been a deafening sound, the rumble of the train crossing the tracks, never happened. I stood there, without understanding, with the truck's engine still running, waiting for something that seemed to never arrive. When I finally decided to follow, a strange feeling came over me. As I crossed the train line, I started to hear the sound of the train, as if it was actually passing by, but the tracks were empty. The sound was crisp and clear, the train passing alongside the truck, but there was nothing there. No vibrations on the tracks, nothing. The sound echoed, but what I saw was only the dark road and empty tracks. Dread began to creep up my spine, and the fear that I was going crazy took hold of me. What the hell was going on? Where was the train? The feeling of dread was palpable. I accelerated the truck, trying to shake off that strange feeling that something was wrong. The sound of the train continued to echo, but I didn't dare look back. Something inside me told me I shouldn't. The fear that the train was somehow following me, watching me, made me feel as if time had distorted. The road in front of me was empty, but the sound, that unmistakable metallic clang of the tracks, was in my ears. It wasn't an echo. It was as if the train was actually passing by, right next to it, as if it had disappeared into the fog. That feeling of being chased consumed me, and it was then that I started to see more lights in the rearview mirror, even though the train was not visible. I looked back quickly, but all I saw was the empty road, lit only by my own headlights. There were no signs that anything was there, but the lights were getting brighter. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was speeding up more and more, trying desperately to escape the incessant sound. I didn't know what was happening, and it only seemed to get worse. The train, or whatever it was, wasn't visible, but I could hear the creaking tracks and the sound of the wheels, as if it were too close but without any presence. I panicked. The sound of the train seemed to be in my ear now, as if it were passing right next to me, but without me seeing it. The wind outside the window was freezing, and I could tell my hands were sweaty as I gripped the steering wheel tightly. I didn't know what else to do. If I stopped, I would have to face something I couldn't understand. If I continued, the sound seemed to consume me even more. It was as if the train was inside my head, an unbearable presence. The lights began to gradually fade, and the sound diminished until suddenly everything was silent. As if it had never existed. When I finally managed to shift my vision to the rearview mirror, what I saw was the reflection of a normal road, without any lights, without any indication that a train had passed. The tranquility of the road seemed absurd. The noise was gone, and now I was back on the regular road, with no explanation for what had just happened. There were no traces of anything. The bridge, the tracks, the sound, everything seemed to have disappeared into thin air. My body was still tense, adrenaline pumping, but the road was now calm, as it should be. I couldn't understand what happened at that crossing. But one thing was certain, I would never look at a railroad the same way again. When I finally arrived in a city, my heart was still racing. I realized that the feeling that something was wrong was not leaving me. The city seemed normal, like any other, but I couldn't stop looking at the railroad tracks, hoping to hear the sound of the train. The rest of the trip was a blur, like I was on autopilot. I couldn't shake the image of the empty tracks and the sound of that non-existent train that somehow still resonated in my mind. I didn't know if it had been a delusion, if I was imagining things, or if something supernatural had really happened there. The truth is that I never went through that train crossing again. Not because I planned it, but because, somehow, the road and circumstances of life led me to other paths. But whenever I find myself on a railway, the feeling of something incomplete, of a train that never arrived, returns. The sound of metal hitting the tracks, the distant echo of what I have never seen, is still present in my mind. Sometimes, when I'm on the road, alone, in the early hours of the morning, I hear that sound again, as if the train is waiting for me, only I can never see it. I've never told this story to anyone, but every time I pass a railway crossing, I remember that sound, the light, the feeling of being watched but not seeing anything. And a part of me, no matter how much I try to ignore it, still believes that something very strange happened that night. Something I can't explain to this day. Maybe the train was just a vision, an illusion of a tired mind. Or maybe it was something much deeper, something I should never have crossed. But what really happened, I will never know. And so, the road continued, as it always does, taking me to unknown places, but with the feeling that, at every turn, at every crossing, the train is still chasing me. Maybe one day I'll see him for what he really was. Or maybe he'll just visit me again when I least expect it. I was in the middle of a desolate stretch, between Arizona and California, and the truck's tank was almost full. Night had fallen, and I hadn't passed through a town in hours. The radio was just making noise, with no signal of any station, and the only sound was the monotonous sound of the engine and the sound of the wind beating against the truck. I was starting to get worried. The road in front of me seemed to go on forever, and I knew that if I didn't find a gas station soon, I would have to stop somewhere deserted and wait until dawn. That's when, in the middle of the darkness, I saw a faint light in the distance. At first I thought it was an optical illusion, something caused by loneliness and tiredness. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a service station. The sign flickered vaguely, as if it was about to fail, but it was still there. The light from those yellow lamps reflected in the puddles of water from the rain that had fallen earlier. The station seemed very isolated, as if it were in the middle of nowhere, but I still felt relieved. The gas wouldn't last much longer, and the last thing I wanted was to be stuck on the road without gas. When I stopped the truck in front of the pump, a strange feeling began to come over me. The station was too quiet. There was no one around, not another soul in the neighborhood. But the strangest thing was the smell. It wasn't the usual smell of fuel, but something more pungent, older, as if the place had long been disused. Still, the pump panel was working. I picked up the cable and started filling the truck, relieved that I was no longer in trouble. The sound of fuel entering the tank was a relief, something simple, but it made me feel like everything would be okay. But when I finished filling up and went around to get into the truck, something was wrong. I looked around and noticed that there was no one else. What appeared to be a gas station was now in ruins. The walls were crumbling, the paint was completely worn away, and the roof looked like it had been abandoned for years, even though I had seen everything in perfect working order a few minutes earlier. The feeling of strangeness increased. I tried looking at the truck's fuel tank, and to my surprise, it was empty. The fuel I had just added was gone. I stood there, looking at the empty tank, not believing what I was seeing. There was no logical explanation for what happened. I had just filled the tank, and now it was empty, as if the fuel had evaporated or simply disappeared. I looked at the pump, which still had the display on, and noticed that the reading indicated that the tank was full. But nevertheless, the reality before me said something else. My heart started to beat faster, and the air around me felt thick, as if something was about to happen. I started walking slowly towards the store door, which was ajar, hoping that someone would be there to explain to me what was going on. The door was locked, but the light inside was still on, shining unevenly, as if someone was trying to hide what was really going on there. I peeked through the broken glass and, for a second, saw a shadow moving inside. I couldn't make out the figure, but the feeling of being watched increased even more. The feeling that this place was out of time, that it was no longer a normal gas station, came over me. I started to feel a cold that didn't come from the temperature, but from something much stranger. It was like I was invading a space that shouldn't exist. I decided to get in the truck and get out of there as quickly as possible. I didn't want to know what was happening anymore. I looked at the dashboard, still trying to process everything that had happened, but something was different. Not only was the fuel gone. The GPS was off, and the dashboard display was blinking, showing a road I didn't recognize. I had never seen that section before, and the strangest thing of all is that I hadn't changed direction. The road seemed to have transformed into something new, distorted, as if I were going to a place that didn't exist. When I tried to start it, the engine wouldn't start. That was enough for panic to take over me. I tried again, but the engine showed no sign of life. It was then that the sound began to come from inside the station. A low, muffled noise, as if something was crawling along the walls. I looked out the window of the truck, and for a second, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the station, watching me. The face was obscured by the dim light of the broken lamp, but I could feel the eyes on her, staring at me. Before I could react, the figure disappeared as quickly as it appeared. The sound of dragging stopped, and absolute silence took over the place. The engine finally started, but something was still wrong. The station seemed to have been swallowed by darkness, and the road in front of me now seemed endless, as if I were stuck in a loop. The feeling of being in a nightmare was strong, but I tried to continue, as if it was just a confusion in my mind. I looked at the fuel rails one more time, and everything was normal. But the fear continued. Something was telling me that I shouldn't have left that post. I sped up, and as I passed where the gas station was supposed to be, the light that was flashing before disappeared. The road was deserted, as if nothing had happened. There was no longer any trace that the post had existed there. The floor was clean, with no sign of dirt or debris. Just the road and the emptiness in front of me. The fuel, the one that had disappeared, was no longer mentioned, and the feeling of something inexplicable was hidden, leaving me with an uneasiness that I would not be able to shake for a long time. That night, after driving for a few hours, I eventually found a real gas station, and when I stopped, I checked my tank. He was full. I had filled up, but the feeling that it wasn't what it seemed, that something was being covered up, didn't leave me. I didn't say anything to the gas station attendant. I didn't know what to say. But I knew that, even though I was in a common post, something from that place continued to watch me, watching me from a distance. I never saw that abandoned station again, and, in fact, I never passed that road again. Every time I look at the truck's dashboard and see the fuel gauge, a part of me wonders if that gas station, that lost fuel, was just an illusion, or if I'm still stuck on the road, in a cycle of places that don't exist. I was at a rest stop, one of those roadside stands where you find more trucks parked than normal cars. The night was calm, almost silent, and I was starting to feel the weight of tiredness after so many hours of driving. I parked my truck and got out to stretch my legs, in no rush to get back on the road. The station was empty, except for a few trucks scattered around. The smell of gasoline and fast food in the air made me feel like this was an ordinary place, but something that night made me look at the parking lot once again. That's when I saw another truck parked, not far from mine, with the engine off, but with the outside lights still on. It was right in the corner, in the furthest part of the station. I found it strange, because most of the drivers had already left or were sleeping. I decided to approach to talk. Maybe the guy was just as tired as I was and was taking a break before continuing. I got close and, upon seeing the truck driver, he raised his hand, as if he was greeting me. The light from the streetlights reflected off his jacket, and his expression looked tired, but not terribly so. He seemed normal, like any other truck driver you meet on the road. We started talking about the road, how the traffic was lighter and the weather was good for traveling. The conversation was calm, as if we had known each other for a long time, but there was something in the air that was bothering me. I didn't know if it was the silence of the station or the fact that the conversation was flowing without too much effort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the environment was different. The truck driver was silent most of the time, but his eyes were fixed on me, as if he was observing me more than participating in the conversation. When I looked at the clock, I realized that we had been talking for over half an hour, but the time seemed to have passed in the blink of an eye. As the conversation began to end, I said goodbye and headed back to my truck, thinking about the strangeness of the situation. However, something was still bothering me. I looked back at the parking lot and realized that the truck the driver was talking about was no longer there. I went to the spot where it was parked and found nothing, not even tire marks. The place was empty, as if no one had stopped there. Confused, I went to the station office to ask if they knew of any trucks that had stopped there, but to my surprise, the records indicated that no one had stopped there in days. Nobody. I looked back at the station, and somehow the silence had intensified. The truck I had talked to that driver about was never there. The feeling of dread washed over me like a cold wave. I tried to rationalize, thinking that maybe tiredness had made me see things or even imagine that conversation. But when I got back to my truck, something told me there was more to the story than just confusion. The station was too quiet, and that conversation, which seemed so real, was still echoing in my head. I sat back in the seat, trying to process everything that had happened, but the sound of the wind and the eerie stillness made me feel like I was being watched, like something wasn't right. I decided to go around the outside and take one last look at the parking lot. Perhaps I had missed some detail. But nothing. No sign of another truck, and the place was even more deserted than before. It was as if the space where the truck was parked had been erased, a part of the station that no longer existed. I looked at the other drivers around, but none of them seemed to notice anything strange. Just the trucks parked, the gas station attendants talking as usual, but the place was enveloped in an unreal silence, as if that station was isolated from the rest of the world. I returned to my truck, more restless than before. When I was about to start the engine and continue my journey, an idea occurred to me. What if the driver I spoke to wasn't real? No, that didn't make sense. I had seen him, talked to him. But the feeling that something was wrong kept bouncing around in my head. The post was the same, but everything around it seemed more oppressive, more empty. I looked once again at the station's records, thinking that perhaps there was an error in the system. However, the records were clear. No one had stopped there in the last few days. And I still remembered the conversation. The smell of the air, the weight of silence, the driver's eyes that never moved. I left quickly, without any further questions. But what haunted me was the fact that, to this day, I have never found an explanation for that driver. Roads can be long and lonely, but something that night made me realize that sometimes they can also be filled with invisible presences. And no matter how many times you pass by a place, some things just can't be explained. I don't know what happened that night, but something tells me that the driver I met at that stop never existed. Maybe he was just a shadow that appeared to remind me of something I still don't understand. When I finally left the post behind, the feeling that something was still there, watching me, didn't leave me. The roads opened before me, as if nothing had happened, but the weight of that moment remained with me. Every part of the road seemed stranger now, as if time was distorting, as if I had crossed a line I shouldn't have crossed. The fear didn't come from a concrete threat, but from the idea that that meeting, that conversation, something that seemed too real, might never have happened. I didn't tell anyone this. Who would believe? The road is full of strange stories, and I knew people might think I was just too tired, seeing things. But to this day, whenever I pass highway checkpoints in isolated places, a part of me looks at the other trucks, trying to find that driver. The feeling that he's still there, waiting to talk once again, doesn't leave me. And every time I see a truck parked alone, a part of me wonders if it will ever come back. I tried to follow my routine, trying to erase that night from my mind, but it's impossible. Something in me knows that that driver never existed, and what happened at that stop was more than just an illusion. Something about that post made me understand that sometimes roads carry more than miles. They carry echoes of encounters that never happened and people who never existed. And as I continue my journey, every lonely night on the roads, I know that, somehow, that silent truck driver, whoever he is, will always be nearby, waiting in some unknown place, on the threshold between the real and the impossible.